Yep. So good time to sign up for that. And just a disclaimer, this is not a series about marriage. This is a series about people. But of course, funnily enough, when you get married, you usually marry a person. So it will be helpful to your marriage. But if you're interested to go further in any of the marriage stuff, please sign up to the course. Okay, so it is complicated. Look, life is complicated. And you don't need me to tell you that. You know that. And I think it was Albert Einstein who said it takes a true genius to take something complicated and make it simple. And lucky for you, actually, no, I'm not that genius, but you've heard that saying before, right? The idea that anyone can take something simple and mess it up and make it complicated. And I often feel like that's what I get to do most weekends. But it's not just relationships that are complicated. It's matters of faith can be complicated, right? And partly why you're here today, maybe because you're trying to figure it out. You're trying to figure out God. Perhaps you had it all figured out and something happened in life, and maybe your worldview or your idea of faith just got blown to smithereens because of life didn't match up with what you thought you believed, and so you're trying to figure it out. Perhaps you've never been to church, or you're watching along at a later date, and this idea to you of God, maybe you've got all these confusing messages. We get it, it's complicated, and so we want to try and help work through the mess of this. And I don't know if there's anything more perhaps messy than the idea of relationships, and particularly when it comes to matters of God and faith and heaven and Jesus. Like this is all this weird interplay, and we want to get it right. And whilst we all might not be geniuses like Albert Einstein and can take things that are super, super complicated and make them sound simple, he gives us a clue to someone who can. And in fact, he wasn't a big fan of Albert Einstein, wasn't a big fan. Isn't it a great shot, by the way? It doesn't just look like a master. Like, I feel like if you work in a university right now and you look like that, everyone would go to your class. So there's a tip for any of the university lecturers here. But he did say something about Jesus. Wasn't a fan of formal religions. And in an interview around 1927, he was asked about faith in Jesus. And here's what he said. Here's what Albert Einstein said. He goes, "I am enthralled by the luminous figure of the Nazarene." Speaking of Jesus, he was from Nazareth. Because no one can read the Gospels, and if you're not familiar with the Bible, the Gospels are our first 4 books of our New Testament, but we'll get to that a little later. No one can read them without feeling the actual presence of Jesus. His personality pulsates in every word, and no myth is filled with such life. So whilst he wasn't a huge fan of organized religion per se, he recognized that there was something amazing about Jesus. And I think there is. And in a world that has multiple layers of complexities, and let's be real, it feels like life is getting a little bit more complicated. Isn't it amazing how language keeps changing, culture changing? You find out something that you could say like yesterday, today you can't say that anymore, right, Brian? Like, it's like every other week we get you up, it's like, Brian, we can't say that anymore. It's like, I could last week, yeah, things have changed, like, if you're married, it's like something that was funny last week, you tried to say it again because there's a winner last week, and this week now you're in trouble for saying the same thing. Like, I don't know, like, life is complicated, and then add to that, like the world into which Jesus arrived had layers and layers of complexities. And if you're familiar with any of the history to which the world Jesus spoke and ministered in, 2,000 years ago in ancient Israel, man, they had layers of complexity. In fact, their whole society, add to the normal layers of the ancient world where you're all pretty much 3 days away from starvation, you were all a day away from some Roman soldier deciding that they were through with you and then that was it, right? Add to all that, then in Israel, they had the layers of religious complexities. And again, for Jewish believers in God, they had in the Christian Bible we refer to as the Old Testament, but it's what they would call their Jewish scriptures. They had over 600 laws that kind of spoke into the way they practice their faith and the way they relate to God. Can you imagine that? Can you just imagine that? Like, I'm struggling to keep up with the road rules these days in Australia. Like, why am I fined 3 points for that? Yesterday it was only a point. Anyway, that's just me. But imagine adding to the laws of the land over 600 religious laws. And this was ancient Israel. So they had the Jewish teachings. And so within that, within not only the laws, they had this complex system set up to connect with God and relate with God. So they had their temple, they had their altar, they had your sacrifices. And again, like these were complex religious structures in order to help allegedly simplify how you and I could kind of connect and relate to God. And again, perhaps if you're new to church or new to faith, that's maybe one of the things that's kind of put you off faith. You feel like, I've got to jump through so many hoops to just kind of understand this belief thing. Like, would you just do an Einstein for me and just simplify it, like make it simple for me? And the problem is this: if in the ancient world, if you were to break any one of those laws, you were required then to make a sacrifice because you had sinned. And so that's where they set up the altar and the temple and kind of all this interplay of religious of steps and order to relate with God. And in the middle of all this, all this complexity, Jesus turns up and he teaches something that was utterly perplexing. In fact, in one of Jesus' most famous sermons, it's recorded in a few of our gospel accounts of his life. It's known as the Sermon on the Mount, and we have our most longest recorded message of Jesus. And he addresses so many of these religious practices and the wrong interpretation of what they meant. And so in the middle of all this, Jesus says something that would just bewildered his audience. And Matthew was paying attention, he was writing notes, and here's what Matthew recorded. Jesus said this: therefore, if you're offering your gift at the altar, remember this is like if you've sinned, like if you're offering your gift, you're bringing could be a heifer or it could be a turtle dove, depending on what you could afford. You're coming to the altar in Jerusalem to offer your sacrifice. And there you remember that your brother or sister, and these are figurative terms, these are like referring to your neighbors, people you're close to, has something against you. Leave your gift there in front of the altar and first go and be reconciled to them. Then come back and offer your gift. Now, we probably miss a lot of the nuance here, so give me a second to explain. If you were a Jew in ancient Israel, you'd go to the temple once, maybe twice a year to offer a sacrifice, okay? It was costly, it took time, people traveled on foot. And so Jesus' audience here was in Galilee, roughly, I think it was 3 days journey on foot. That sounds about right, Woodsy, about 3 days from Galilee. Now, if you've ever anyone here been hiking before and you're married to someone, you wanted to impress someone on a date or do something with the kid, and you go for just 1 day's hike, you spend the next several days doing what? You're recovering, complaining, regretting it, or maybe you loved it, I don't know. So to Jesus' audience, he's talking about you going to the altar. That's like a 3 days journey to Jerusalem. Now, you get there, okay, Jerusalem. If you've been in the Middle East before, first thing everyone says, it's hot here, okay? So you get to the temple in Jerusalem. The lines are long. The sun is hot. The children are unruly. The animals are like, unsettled because like, why am I here? And what's all this blood stuff? And hang on a second, they're cluing onto things. And could you imagine the smell? You're going to sacrifice. And then Jesus says, if you're waiting in line like that, and you've traveled 3 days foot to be there, and it dawns on you as you're in the line holding your little turtle dove or your little sheep or something, oh man, my neighbor, oh boy, we're not reconciled. Jesus is saying, here's what I want you to do. Leave the little Lemmy there, pack the kids up, walk back, make things right, then come back, pick up your place in the line, which I'm sure people just let you right back in. And can you imagine when Jesus said to people like, come again? Like, you're saying we've made all this effort to get there and make things right with God, and you're saying for us to leave it and we've got to make things, like, the question is, surely if you're Jesus' audience, like, what could be more pressing than making peace with God? Like, this is why we are here. Our whole society, our whole world is set up with all these great orders and structures. Like, surely the most important thing is for me to make my peace with God. But Jesus is saying, actually, there's something I want you to do first. First, I want you to make peace with the people around you. Now, again, this is annoying more than anything else, right? It's like, okay, I'm trying to just get the faith thing right, Johnny. Like, I'm just getting my head around this. And now you're saying like the whole faith and people thing go hand in hand. Well, according to Jesus, yeah. Again, this probably isn't sounding like it's getting simpler. This whole thing might be sounding it's getting more complex too, and I apologize for that, but hang with me. In other words, it's almost as if Jesus is suggesting that the true indication of your and my authentic desire to make things right and to be at peace with our Heavenly Father is to go and make things right with our neighbor. And Jesus introduced, or he rather clarified what it meant for us to make peace with God. It was always reflected in how we made peace with people. And here's what's frustrating. And you know this, people are the most complicated thing on this planet. some of you would prefer to be doing calculus and physics and chemistry than deal with people, right? It's like, the reason so many people are buying dogs these days is they just seem to be way less complicated. Some of you prefer to work in the garden than work with people. Do I have any people that can relate? Right? Like, people are complicated. And I say this all the time, it's one of the most encouraging things I can say. You're a complicated mess, Like, we don't so am I. I'm the king of the complication. Like we don't understand why we do the things that we do most of the time. Why did I do that? Times that by 8 billion people. Like, we are complicated. But as complicated as we are, it is for people that Jesus gave up his life for people. And as complicated and as weird and complex as we are, it is people who are made in the image of God. And so no wonder, it should be no surprise that Jesus centers his teaching about God on the treatment of people. And can I tell you why we wanted to do this series and why it's important, and to not skip over the human interrelation part of our faith, is over the last 2 and a bit years, as we all journeyed through, something that there was really no script for us to, what to do, just with everything kind of being more complicated than ever before. You guys lived in the real world, and you got to experience how to navigate this in your own family, in your own life, in your own career, in your own mental health, your own faith journey through it all. As I looked around and I tried to engage with as many people as I could, I realized something. We're not always too good at this. And I feel like the complexity of the past 2 years or so exposed maybe some flaws in how you and I have learnt to relate to one another. And I experienced, to be honest with you, if I was to give us all as a human species a report card on how we got along over the past 2 years, probably give us like a C-. I don't know how you'd rate it. I just think we all of a sudden started putting our view of something often ahead or in front of the you standing in front of you. And I saw relationships divide and break up over differing of views, and we started playing games. We started letting polarizing ideas and politics play into how we get along with one another. And I saw people get offended and ticked off at stuff. I'm like, really? Is that more important than the person standing in front of you? Is that worth breaking relationship over? Like, what's more important? And I get it, it's complex. I'm not trying to simplify. Maybe I am. I'm trying to clarify what's more important than opposing views. Some of the stuff broke my heart. I came across marriages who were torn apart because of their different views about things happening in the world that had never happened before. And I'm like, we've got to relearn how to engage with this. And there's something in our faith, there's something in what Jesus shows that hopefully helps us, because it is too easy for us to label people. And come on, we can all be guilty of this. There's someone with an opposing view or opposing take on something, we can label them, we can box them in, we can stick with our own echo chamber, say all people who think that like that are like this, or all people who watch that or go there, they're all like this. It's easy for us to draw labels of people. But in a world growing more and more divided and complicated, if you're a Jesus follower, we don't have the option to play those kinds of games. As Jesus followers, we aren't invited to play games with the people in our world. We are invited to follow the way of Jesus. And the good news is, the best part about Jesus is he didn't just teach about this. He lived this. It wasn't just a theoretical and, I'm going to tell you what to do and tell you all you're wrong. Jesus exemplified for us how to walk amongst the complexities and the nuances and the difficulties of human relationships. Again, take Jesus for a moment, okay? If you've ever spent time reading the life of Jesus through the Gospels, you would know the man was the master at dealing with awkward situations. The man was the master at dealing with people. And he seemed to effortlessly be able to meander and move between the most diverse and complex forms of human interaction. Jesus was a master of this. He was perfect at it. Jesus could go in one conversation from dealing with bullies and haters to like having adoring fans and fanatics around him. Somehow Jesus could handle every single critic he encountered with grace and strength and care and wit. In a society that labeled people and boxed people in, Jesus could seemingly walk into places that a rabbi and a man and a Jewish man should never go. Jesus dignified women, and women of all forms of the social hierarchy that usually were boxed in and labeled. Jesus seemed to effortlessly be able to communicate with people that men should have never been communicating with. And one of the most undervalued and underrated types of human beings on the planet throughout all of history, children, Jesus welcomed and loved them, and children loved being around him. He wasn't someone like, get these kids out of my way. So he could relate with adults, he could relate with the top, but he could also relate with children and the lowest. Jesus could easily sway between relating to a beggar with leprosy on the street and then confronting a king or a ruler with his correction about how wrong they're leading. I love this, Jesus could inspire hardened tradesmen, but then go and cry with women. He was both. He was intellectually robust with the best of them, but then he could also be sensitive with grieving mothers. Jesus was the master at relating and walking and communicating with people. And so, in classic Jesus fashion, when it came to dealing with the complexities of human relationships, he didn't merely give us something to believe. What did he do? He gave us something to do. And this is where, okay, and if you're a Jesus follower here, I'm so sorry, because you're probably like, Jono, I believe, is that not good enough for me? Well, according to Jesus, our belief has to kind of have some kind of literal life-giving something with your life. Do something with it. And so Jesus doesn't just give us something to believe, he gives us something to do. Now, same sermon that I quoted from before, but a different scribe. This is Luke's account of the same sermon. Jesus gives us something to do. When it comes to the myriad of layers of how do we interrelate with our neighbors, our spouse, our boss, our employees, our pastor, people we disagree with. Jesus gives a one line, and again, you might not be a Christian here or never read the Bible before, but you've probably heard this line, it's probably a version of it, and in our society, it's known as the golden rule. And Jesus came up with it. And here's how Luke records it. Jesus said this, here's what I want you to do. I simply want you to do to others, you guys know this one? As you would have them do to you. Read that for a moment. Do to others as you would have them do to you. Now, sounds simple enough, right? But come on, we all know the actual application of this one principle is there's layers to it. And it might be simple to get your head around. It's more difficult to put into practice. But Jesus tries to simplify it. Okay, you want to know all these complex layers of human relations? Here's what I want you to do. Just do to others as you would have them do to you. Sounds simple enough, but let's break this down for a moment. Why is it when someone does something, okay, we're talking about the doing to others you would have them do to you. Why is it when someone does the do to you? Why is it when they do the do to you, it's usually simple. Like, you know why they did it. If someone offended you or someone upset you, we all know why they did it, right? It's usually black and white. It's because they're mean, or they're an evil person, or they're wrong, or they're insensitive. How easy we can interpret and label someone else's doing unto us. It's simple when it's someone else, right? We know why they did it. They're impatient, or they're just self-centered, or they're just rude. Like, we know why someone has done unto us. But when it's what we do unto them, it's not so simple, is it? Because you and I, well, we're complicated. There's usually good reason why you and I did the do unto them part. We can easily simplify what they did unto me. It's because they're just wrong and they're nasty and they're a piece of work. But when it comes to me, no. Let me explain to you why it came across like that. Like, I'm not so simple. I am complicated. I am nuanced. Don't we do that? Like, if they could sit down and just give us a moment, we would explain why we were late. Or if they can just give us a moment, we can explain why we're a bit short with them. Like, just be patient. Give me a moment. I can explain. For you, it's black and white, but for me, it's complicated. Jesus saying, so to work out this mess, just do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Because surely, how do we want people to do unto us? When we've done wrong by someone, when we've hurt someone, we've let someone down, or we've broken a promise, or we've broken relationship, what do we want? We want compassion. We want understanding. I certainly do, don't you? I want people to be gracious with me. I want people to be patient with me. I want people to give me the time of day. That's what I want. And so Jesus is saying, well, if that's what you want people to do to you, do it to them. Simple enough, right? Now, again, this is Jesus trying to simplify something complicated. And he wasn't the only rabbi who tried this. In fact, it's very likely that one of the rabbis who influenced Jesus as he was growing up was a rabbi in the 1st century BC known as Rabbi Hillel. And the famous story throughout Jewish folklore about a question he was once asked by a Gentile, someone who wasn't a Jew, to help explain to him and to simplify the whole Jewish law, or what they call the Torah. And apparently, as the story goes, this Gentile who wanted to be converted to Judaism, his challenge to every rabbi he met was, I want you to explain to me the whole Torah while I stand on one foot. In other words, you should be able to explain it simple enough and don't draw it out and be long and boring till I lose my balance. Explain to me simply. And no rabbi would give him the time of day. But when he came to Rabbi Hillel, here's how he simplified the whole Jewish teaching. He said this to him. He says, what is hateful to you, do not do to your neighbor. That is the whole Torah. The rest is commentary. Go and learn. Simple enough. Now, things kind of similar. It's kind of like the negative inversion where Jesus kind of gave the positive. He didn't say it's about what you refrain to do. It's about being intentional about what you do. Go and do to others if you have had them do to you. Now, who are these others that Jesus is referring to? Surely the others that he's saying do unto others are people who are like me, people who think like me, people who are kind to me, people who are my friends. As we see what Jesus says next, nope. He had a much bigger term when he refers to the others. He goes on in the next verse and says this. If you love those who love you, you know where this is going, don't you? If you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners love those who love them. If you're not a normal church person, this term often in the first century in Israel referred to pretty much anyone who would overtly break any of their religious laws. And if you were a good Jew, like anyone who was different to you, you'd usually label them a sinner. It was like a catch-all term of people who didn't live as good as you. So Jesus is saying, even sinners, people who aren't as good as you, even they love people who love them. Goes on. And if you do good to those who do good to you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners do that. You're nothing special if you do that. Next one. And if you lend to those from whom you expect repayment, well, what credit is that from you? Even sinners lend to sinners, expecting to be repaid in full. Next verse. But love your enemies. Hang on a second. Love our who? Do good to them. Lend to them without expecting to get anything back. Is there another one or is that the last? That's the last of the verse? I thought that's the last. Good. Love your enemies without expecting to get anything back. A quick note on enemy love, because I don't want to, this isn't about that, but I don't want to fly by this point. Jesus said to love our enemies. Enemy love in the Christian worldview isn't some arbitrary law amongst many that Jesus taught. In fact, and I would lean to this, it's been argued often that the idea of enemy love is absolutely central to all of Jesus' teaching and more so all of Jesus' life. It reflected the course of his entire life, particularly shown in the way that he gave his life on a cross. He said he didn't die for people who were like him or people who were righteous or people who had it all together. He died for sinners. He died for what would be deemed as an enemy. Enemy love was at the core, not only of Jesus' teaching, but of his very existence and ministry. So for Jesus, he wasn't just spitting some arbitrary, a good thought out philosophical appraisal of how to get along with people. To love your enemies. He lived it. He gave his life for it. It's what makes Jesus so extraordinary. But notice the words here. It says, love your enemies. Lend to them without expecting to get anything back. And here's my point of today and where we want to go with this series. When we think about what we expect from people, whether we expect people to treat us a certain way, people to pay us back, or people to render kindness for kindness, or an eye for an eye, whatever it might be, often our expectation is at the root of so many of the complexities of all of our relationships. Think about it. It's usually the gap between what you expect from someone and what we experience that most of the tension lies in our relationships with one another. I mean, if you've got any kind of relationship, think for a moment, someone you experience tension with. Isn't there usually a gap between what you expect is good behavior and what you expect, how you should be treated and how you expect a relationship to work? But then you experience what you've experienced. It's something you expect for them to do, but then it's something they actually do. And it's usually that gap there, that gap that creates most of our human complexities. If everyone behaved the way we expected them to, relationships wouldn't be complicated. But we don't. And so there's a gap. And to land today and begin this series, I just want to speak about this gap. Because you and I, we choose what we put in that gap. And when you experience that with another person, what do you put in that gap? Now you might be thinking, no, I don't choose to put anything in that gap. Like it's a knee-jerk reaction. I just kind of do what I've always done. But based off Jesus' teaching, he's like, no, there's something to do here, and you choose what to do here. And what does it mean to do unto others in that gap? Now, if there's a gap between me and another person, and I've done something that's offended another person or hurt another person, what am I hoping that they would put in that gap? Because if you ever experienced that like something's happened and you haven't had a chance to clarify it with your neighbor or your spouse or your boss or your colleague, what do we do in that gap? If you're anything like my tendency, I'm quick to fill that gap with like the worst assumptions. It's like, oh, they're out to get me, or they want my job, or they're mean, or they haven't thought about me. We fill it. We don't fill it with kindness. We don't fill it with grace. So here's my challenge to us. How do we put into practice the do unto others part in this gap? Here's what I want you to do. And you're not going to like this. It's not going to be your favorite thing, and you're not going to say amen and clap and go, that was the best thing I've ever heard. I'm so grateful. You're not going to like this at all. But it's putting legs on Jesus' teaching to do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Here's what I want you to do when it comes to that gap. Next time you encounter it, which will probably be on the way home today. Perfect timing, Mark. He's a pro. This guy knows. He's been married for 2 weeks. He knows what's up. Here's what I want you to choose to do. I want you to choose trust over suspicion. Choose trust. When there's silence in a relationship, there's that gap, there's been a breakdown in comms, we will all feel that pull and that tension to fill that gap with suspicion and to fill it with the worst case scenario. I know why they said it like that. I know why they haven't replied to my message. I know why they didn't say hello to me when they walked past. And we fill that gap with suspicion, the worst case scenario. But if the shoe's on the other foot, how do you want someone to treat you? Oh, there was a reason I was in a rush. My kid was sick. There literally was a car accident. My dog literally ate my homework, We want people to show us grace. Jesus, here simplifies it. Would you do to others as you'd want them to do that? In other words, when there's a gap, of course, eventually close the gap, communicate, get on the same page. But when there's a gap where a lot of the complexities sit, choose to fill that void with trust. Here's a test for us all. When you get a message from your boss saying, hey, we need to chat, what's your go-to assumption about what's going to happen? I was asking a few of the guys before the service about this, and one of our dudes in the tech booth said to me, I got a message from my boss saying, oh, we need to catch up today in my office. And he's like, I'm gone. And he was convinced he was getting fired, convinced. I'm like, well, what happened? And he goes, I got a promotion and a pay rise. I'm like, so let me get this right. So you went through all this anxiety and all this worry and all this stress because you chose to fill that gap with suspicion. What if you swapped it around? What if we practiced together in all of our relationships, filling it with trust? Now, I know this seems impossible, especially when it comes to enemies, strangers, however you label people like that. Surely there's good reasons to be suspicious. So before we get to the stranger and enemy part through this series, here's what I want you to leave today. Try practicing with your neighbor, your spouse, your literal neighbor, your boss, your colleagues who you work with every day. I want you to practice this. For example, if someone's late, I know why you're late. You're lazy, this person's not committed, they don't prioritize this. What if it's like, I'm sure they've got good reason. I'm sure they've got good reason. Because what you do then, when you choose trust in those moments, the relationship doesn't fester and build this kind of grating nature of mistrust and suspicion. No one wants relationships built on that. So choose trust. Your loved one or someone who you're working with or someone you live with, they're moody. Oh man, I know why they're moody. They're just selfish. They never think about it. They always ruin atmosphere. I know why they're moody. What if it's like, I'm going to trust. Maybe there's a lot going on today. Maybe something happened at home that I'm just not aware of. I know if that was me and I was rocking up moody today, maybe it's an anniversary of a loved one who just passed. Maybe they just lost a relationship. Maybe they just found out they got a bad health diagnosis. I don't know. So in those moments, in the same way you'd want someone to be patient. You see where I'm going with this? Do unto others Choose trust. Oh, this person, like, they're so quiet today. I know they're scheming against me. They're gunning for me. I know. Or maybe, I don't know, maybe they've read something today and they're thinking over it and they're trying to. This principle outplays into so many of our relationships. Here's what happens when we choose trust. We assume the best. We grow in patience. It's an opportunity to give love, to provide grace. And when you and I choose trust, we are building the kind of relationships that we all want. No one wants to let suspicion lead and set the tone. Have you ever been in a relationship like that where it's always suspicion? Maybe you're in a marriage like that today. It sets a horrible tone and precedent for our relationships. It divides, it damages, it robs us of joy. And then we need laws and rules to get along, and it just complicates things. So choose trusts. Are there guarantees? No, there's not. Can people break our trust? I guess so. But do you want to live with suspicion all your life? Is that how you want to live? Is that how you want to conduct your relationships? I got a hunch that you don't. But when you and I choose trust over suspicion, what we're finding is we are doing the same thing that our Heavenly Father has done for us. And here's how Jesus finishes his teaching. He puts it this way. He goes, if you do this, right? If you do unto others, including your enemies, including those that maybe your instinct is to be suspicious, but you don't. He goes, then your reward will be great and you'll be children of God. You'll be children of the Most High because this is what he is like. God is kind. And he's kind to the upright. He's kind to the kind. He's kind to the merciful. He's kind to those who are super religious. It's not what he says. Jesus says God is kind to the ungrateful. God is kind to the wicked. This is what God is like. How often when we're not sure about something, we're like, oh, I bet you God's angry with me, hey. Like, and you're not sure why things have happened. We feel that, I'm not sure with God's abandoned me, God doesn't love me. Jesus is like, nah. He's even kind to the ungrateful. Oh, it's because I've messed up. I know this is why bad things have happened. I've messed up. No, because God is kind to the wicked. You seeing this? We filled silence with suspicion. And he finalized by saying this, be merciful, just as your Father, your Heavenly Father, just as God is merciful. My question I want to leave you with today is, who do you love that needs your trust more than your suspicion? We get a whole month to delve into these tensions, right? But I want you to just practice this. And again, I'm not saying you don't have to go out on enemy love just yet. I'll give you a leave pass for a few weeks before we get there. The whole stranger thing. Just start with someone in your circle. This will come up several times during your day with a colleague, with a boss, with an employee, with your principal. It'll come up all the time, and you'll see the opportunity every day when there's a breakdown in communication and when the temptation to fill that with suspicion and assume the worst of the other person. Remember the words of Jesus. Right now in these moments, do to them as you wish they would be doing to you right now where there's a gap. Fill that gap, not with suspicion. Fill it with trust. Be merciful as your Father is merciful. I don't know how many times Chloe and I have turned to each other and there's been a gap between us and someone else after each other, and we just go and we say it out loud, I'm going to choose trust right now. I'm going to choose trust. And maybe this could be something that we can all do. Wherever our faith is at, something we can all do. They're going to make all of our relationships a little less